Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish it weren't with all my might, a large Torcano burning bright. Chapter 19. Though crossing Torcano Alley in darkness may have been a foolhardy venture, to just sit around and wait for cruel soldiers to show up and arrest them would be stupidity in its finest form. The half moon, hanging in a clear night sky, provided some light, but also created long, dark shadows that could be mistaken for the seemingly bottomless cracks in the earth. The other travelers followed Jack and Jill, crisscrossing and sidestepping, while placing all their trust in the unpredictable ground beneath their feet. Again, Jean demonstrated firsthand the usefulness of sticks when Jill used him to tap at the ground in front of her as she walked, testing it for stability. The silk slippers provided Elsbeth's feet with little comfort on the rocky ground as she followed behind Jill and directly in front of Jack, while Winky and the trio of tailless mice rode upon Jack's broad shoulders. Georgie, at the end of the group, stopped to make frequent checks on the cliffs behind them. It was hard to tell in that faint blue moonlight, but after an hour without incident, it looked as if they'd made it nearly halfway across. That was when Georgie turned, stood silent for a moment, and said, "Uh-oh." There they were, 100 strong, lined up along the edge of the cliff, dark, spear-holding silhouettes that, from this distance and in this light, strongly resembled a wrought iron fence. "It's okay," said Jack, in a less than convincing voice. "They'll never come after us while it's still dark." No sooner had Jack uttered those words than Cruel's men began guiding their horses down the zigzag trail and into Torcano Alley, where they would have a distinct advantage over their prey. "I don't believe it," said Jill. "What do we do? They're sure to catch us on horseback." "There's only one thing we can do," said Earl Grey. "We've got to pick up the pace." Without discussing it further, Jill continued, this time faster and less certain than before. "Watch it here," she cautioned, while using Jean to point out a large crevasse hidden in the shadow of a petrified oak tree. By the time they'd gotten around it safely, they could hear the sounds of horses' hooves, some 400 strong, clip-clopping across the desert floor. "We're not going to make it," said Georgie, glancing over his shoulders. "Don't be ridiculous," said Elsbeth. "Of course we'll make it." "Only if we run," said Jill. "Then let's run," said Elsbeth, confused as to why any discussion of it was necessary. "But if we run," said Jack, "we could fall to our deaths." "Seriously," said Elsbeth, "you people are absurd." Elsbeth pushed her way to the front, hiked up her gown, and broke into a jog. Not surprisingly, she was in no better shape now than she had been several hours earlier when running from the castle to the forest. As before, a searing pain developed quickly across her abdomen as she sucked in more oxygen than her atrophied lungs could process. Just when she thought she could continue no farther, the ground beneath her feet crumbled and she began to fall. She barely had time to scream when her arm was nearly dislocated at the elbow as she found herself dangling above a large sinkhole, rocks and pebbles plopping into a bright orange bed of magma some 50 feet down. The only thing that had stopped her from plunging into it herself was Jack, who held firmly to Elsbeth's wrist, while Winky clung tightly to her hair. When Jack had seen the girl falling, the lunge he'd taken to save her had caused Winky to tumble off his shoulder, fall down his arm, and land squarely on Elsbeth's head. "Sorry," said Winky, though he did not loosen his grip on Elsbeth until Jack had hoisted her up and placed the shaken girl on more solid ground. "Thought we'd lost you there," said Jack. "Again." "I hate this place," Elsbeth panted, breathless from both the near-death experience and the running that had preceded it. Then, remembering that her life had just been saved, she added, "Thank you, Jack." "No problem. You know, you can call me Dad if you want," Jack said hopefully. His face exposed the disappointment he felt when Elsbeth replied only with, "I know." The sinkhole, in addition to having nearly been the end of young Elsbeth Puel, also allowed Cruel's men to close the gap even farther. The healthy head start that Elsbeth and her friends once enjoyed had withered and wasted away to a mere 5-minute lead, while the forest was still a good hour away. "I'm afraid it's over," said Georgie. They stood and watched the horsemen moving nearer and nearer, and while Georgie and the others hung their heads in defeat, Elsbeth did what she did best. She got mad. "No," she growled with fists in the air. "It's not going to end this way. We're not going to take this. Do you hear me? We're not going to take it." The longer she yelled, the louder she got. Strangely, however, the louder she got, the more difficult she was to hear. A competing noise was rising up from the desert. From this distance, it could have been a large twinkling star hanging just above the horizon, but of course it wasn't. Torcano, said Jill, as it grew closer, larger, and hotter. It's a big one, said Jack, now yelling because in addition to the whirring of rocks and lava, there was a sound of 100 panic-stricken horses rearing up, snorting, whinnying, and throwing riders to the ground. We should run, said Georgie. No, said Jill. We don't know what path it will take. We're better off to stay where we are and hope it spares us. Trust me, Jack and I have been through a few of these in our time. Easy for you to say, said Jean. You're not made of wood. Maybe it'll hit Cruel's men, said Barry White. If there's any justice in this world, Jack added, while taking his wife's hand and squeezing tightly. He felt someone gripping his other hand and looked down to see that it was Elsbeth, her eyes lost in the fiery tunnel, racing toward them. Those few who have seen and survived it will tell you there's nothing quite so beautiful and mesmerizing as a torcano at night. Like a towering bonfire of gas and stone spinning across a darkened sky, it would seem certain that this is what the birth of the universe or the beginning of our galaxy must have looked like. For the record, Jack had been right. This was a big one. The narrow end of its funnel nearly as wide as the gap separating Elsbeth and her friends from Cruel's men and their terrorized horses. But neither the horses nor the soldiers had need to worry because the Torcano had chosen its path. When it became all too apparent which direction it would favor, Jack yelled, "Run!" But running was of no consequence to a monster of this size and speed. Those of Cruel's men who had not been thrown to the ground sat atop their horses and watched as the Torcano quickly chased down the escaped prisoners and mercifully, if nature can show mercy, swept across them in an instant. The soldiers took no joy in what they had seen as the Torcano continued on its path. Once the terrible noise had faded and the horses were again relatively calm, the large man with the Van Dyke beard led his horse to the site where Elsbeth and the others had last been seen. He climbed down from his mount, and when the dust had settled sufficiently, he spotted on the ground a single slipper, its once pink silk now charred black and still smoldering. As a rooster crowed somewhere far off in the distance, the man knelt and plucked the shoe from the ground. That's it, then, he said in a quiet voice. That's the end of her. Cock-a-doodle-doo, my dame has lost her shoe, or if you prefer, her shoe lost her, when away she flew.